In this video, I'll show you how you can deploy a service using code that's present on GitHub. So I have a repository here called Simple Service, and it's actually a Gradio application. If you're not familiar with Gradio, Gradio is a library, Python library that is used to build UIs. It is especially used in ML use cases wherein you want to build a small UI demos for your ML applications. So in this case, what I have is a simple interface that takes a name as an input and returns hello name as the output. And so this is the main.py file. Apart from that, in this repository, I have the requirements.txt, which corresponds to the Python libraries that is required by this project. And finally, I have my Docker file, which gives instructions on how to build a Docker image from this repository. So you can see what we're doing here is we are copying the requirements file into TMP folder on the image. We are installing all the requirements from the requirements.txt file. And finally, we start the application by running python main.py. So this is the repository that we have, and we want to deploy this using True Foundry. To deploy this repository or using True Foundry, you want to first go to the deployments tab. From there, you want to press on new deployment, and then you want to pick a service, because what we have in the code is essentially a service. The other options for deployment include jobs, where you have like either a one-time job or you might have like a recurring cron job. If you have a model that you want to deploy as a service, you have the model deployment option. And for advanced users, you have the Helm deployment, wherein you can directly deploy Helm chart. Or if you want to mount a volume into the cluster, you can choose that as well. But in this case, we'll stick with service since what we want to deploy is a service. And the next step is to choose a workspace. Immersed workspace is the workspace that we created in the previous video that we'll choose for this particular deployment. In case you already did not create this workspace, then you can go back to the previous video to refer to and create a workspace for yourself. And after that, I hit next step. Then I want to give a name to the service. So I say hello radio app. The next step is to refer to the source. So what I have here is a private repository, and since it's a private repository, I want to integrate GitHub with TrueFoundry before I can deploy this. So I click on Integrate Git. Then I go here to the Integrations tab. You can also get here by pressing Integrations and then Git, and then I say Link GitHub. So I said Srihari TF. That's my GitHub account. I really want to share permission for select repositories, and I want to share it for simple service. And then I say install. So I have successfully linked my GitHub repository with TrueFoundry. Now I should be able to use this for deployments here. So when I come here, that repository should be available for me to use. Sure enough, I can see simple service here. I want to deploy the main branch, so I choose main. The next section is regarding how to build the service. So if you remember from the repository, we have a Docker file there. And so we choose the option to build from Dockerfile. The path to Dockerfile is obviously the root of the repository, followed by the name of the Dockerfile. And path to the build context is again the root of the repository. And Docker registry refers to the registry where I want to store the image once it's built. You can add your own registry as well, but I've left it to the default registry that's available with TrueFoundry for this particular control plane. So I leave it at the default. The other option that I want to provide is the port number. So if I go back to the code and if I go to main.py, you can see that I'm starting the Gradio app at the port number 8080. This is the port that I want to expose as well. So I set the port to 8080. I keep exposed checked. And then the endpoint, I can configure this. I have the domain demo.truefoundry.com available, and I have to set a set a subdomain. So I said that is Gradio app. Apart from these, there is a bunch of other configurations that you can do as well. For example, you can pass on environment variables. You can change the amount of resources that needs to be configured for this application. For me, the default looks good for me, so I just leave it as is. And there is a bunch of advanced fields as well, but I'll not go into this at this point in time. So with the ports being configured, I hit submit. So as you can see that the application has turned up under the services tab on the deployments page. And if I look at the status, it's initializing at this point in time. It's moved on to the building stage. So I can maybe take a look at the build logs here. And it says provisioning node to build image. So in the building stage, what is happening is the code is getting pulled from the GitHub repository, and then we are essentially running Docker build to create the Docker image using the Docker file. So this should take maybe a minute or two. We'll wait for that to happen. So let's go back to the homepage. So the build is still taking place, and it's finally transitioned to build success. After build success, we start the actual deployment. So you can see that one of the pods has come up. There's a endpoint that is turned up here as well. Before we go to the endpoint, let's see what else is available. Let's click on the name of the application to see more application details. So you have the pod section where you can see the pods that are running this application. In this case, we only have one pod running because we set the number of replicas to default, which is one. They show the application versions. So in this case, I deployed a particular commit from my GitHub repository. And let's say I make some changes there and I want to update it. So what I can do is I can come here, I can edit this application, update the commit shaw or maybe change the branch or something like that. And then I can deploy this again. All the other configuration, they'll remain as is, so you wouldn't have to worry about them. And when you deploy the second version, it'll create a version 2 here, and that will be the active version that's running on the pods. The third tab is environment variables, which we did not set any for this particular case. None of them shows up here because we have no environment variables. Then there's a bunch of other things like application spec, which is basically a description of the application that TrueFoundry understands. You have the events tab where you can see what's happened on the cluster as you deploy this application, and after that as well. You have the metrics tab where you can see the metrics of the particular application that we just deployed, which includes CPU usage, memory usage, network usage, and so on and so forth. And finally, you have the logs, which refers to the application logs. So let's say your application is producing logs on the standard output, then the log should be turning out here on this particular tab. You can also go to here from here by directly clicking on logs. Yeah. And finally, let's go to the endpoint here and see what the application looks like. So this is the application that we just deployed. So if I enter a name, let's enter the name True Foundry, it would just say hello to Foundry. So you can see the application is working as expected at the endpoint that we just gave it, right? Gradio app.demo.truefoundry.com. So that is how you deploy an application from GitHub using True Foundry. We will see what else we can do using True Foundry in the coming videos.